The ICMPD Anti-Trafficking Programme has been conducting empirical research on the phenomenon of human trafficking in dynamic mixed migration contexts and humanitarian crisis since 2014. The latest ICMPD study, called The Strength to Carry On, was published in 2019 and is designed specifically to provide an evidence base for our actions in the areas of migration policy, asylum policy, and combating human trafficking. Within this study, specific details about 69 potential trafficking cases were identified in the course of the research, and 14 cases of deprivation of liberty for extortion. A minority of these cases were officially identified by the authorities. Despite the lack of official statistics, there are many indications of trafficking among people using the migration routes, including trafficking for sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, exploitation in forced criminal activities such as migrant smuggling and drug trafficking, and forced marriage, as well as deprivation of liberty for extortion. During 2015 and 2018, which was the chronological scope of the research, those who have been identified along the Balkan route are mostly from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Syria, and mostly boys and men. While along the central Mediterranean route, they are mostly Nigerians and other sub-Saharan Africans, mostly women, who are trafficked for sexual exploitation. Exploitation takes place in countries of origin prior to departure, in transit countries outside Europe, such as Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Libya, and in countries of transit and destination in Europe. Exploitation is generally not coordinated along the route, but a person may be exploited in different countries and locations by actors that are not necessarily in contact with each other. The main modus operandi of traffickers in the context of the migration routes, regardless of whether or not they also provide migrant smuggling services, is abusing people's position of vulnerability. This vulnerability arises from their need to use and to pay for migrant smuggling due to the lack of alternatives for regular travel. When we talk about vulnerability, we refer to the risks of trafficking and factors that make people traveling along the migration routes more likely to be trafficked or exploited. In contexts where people are in situations of vulnerability to trafficking, only in certain specific cases they may become victims of the crime of human trafficking or other abuses. Issues related to age and gender are factors of vulnerability. Children are vulnerable to trafficking and other abuses per se because of their lack of life experience. However, the circumstances of their migration journey may increase or reduce their vulnerability. Women and girls are at a higher risk of sex trafficking in particular, as well as related abuses such as survival sex and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Men and boys are generally considered more resilient, yet they are also exposed to specific vulnerabilities and gendered expectations. This creates a paradox of vulnerable groups, whereby people considered the most vulnerable tend to have better access to services en route and in destination contexts, while people not considered vulnerable are actually rendered more vulnerable due to lack of access. One of the key findings of our research is that vulnerability is determined by migration policies and practices. The circumstances of the journey determine many of the key factors of resilience and vulnerability and are conditioned by the contextual policy factors. The need to use these routes due to the lack of alternatives for regular travel and the consequent need to use migrant smuggling services is definitely the defining factor of vulnerability. The journey itself is a driver of vulnerability. The restrictions on movement and mobility that have been progressively imposed by European countries since 2016 have significantly increased the vulnerabilities of people using the routes. Well, firstly, it is important to understand vulnerability in order to improve responses. In certain specific cases, situations of vulnerability to human trafficking, as I said, can present indicators of actual trafficking cases, which in turn, further investigation may be determined to constitute the crime of trafficking in persons, and this can be only done by the national authorities. In order to reduce trafficking and other abuses, the focus should be on reducing vulnerabilities and exposure to different dangers on the one hand, and building capacity to resist on the other. Trafficking and other abuses take place because people are vulnerable and people are exposed to dangers and are not in a position to resist these dangers. In addition, what is important is there is the need for a paradigm shift in how trafficking, refugee, migration, and child protection policies are viewed in terms of access to protection. While policymakers and practitioners might see themselves as working in distinct fields on specific topics, the human beings in need of protection do not always fall under one single clear-cut category. People on the move are vulnerable because of their need to move, and because this means that they often simultaneously hold multiple legal statuses. They are refugees, internally displaced persons, irregular migrants, or trafficked people. In order to avoid a situation where such girls and boys, women and men fall through the cracks of state policy and legislative frameworks just because they do not fit into one specific category, the anti-trafficking stakeholders must collaborate closely with the stakeholders working on internal displacement, international protection, child protection, irregular migration, and migrant smuggling. Looking to the future, I believe we can and we must do better. The simple fact that a girl, boy, woman, or man is seeking refuge from violence and persecution in Europe, or seeking a better life for themselves and their families, should not mean that they are subjected to human and child rights violations en route to Europe. Although everyone is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, it is the most vulnerable people, those at the margins of society, that are at particular risk. So in the context of the pandemic, each person is simultaneously affected by a number of overlapping and interacting factors of vulnerability. For instance, in the case of COVID-19, the medical systems are overwhelmed, and in some countries, they can't serve all those in need of medical care. Due to the lockdown measures, people are prevented to going to work, and it had an impact on the source of income, which is the economic impact of the pandemic. For some people, this means that they cannot fulfill their basic needs, such as food. This can lead to women and children, men and boys, being forced to work in dangerous conditions to gain income and food, which is the social impact of the pandemic. Evidently, one crisis can have many impacts that are interconnected with one another, and there is no single solution. But what is important to take into consideration all these different factors of vulnerability that may be caused by the pandemic when countries are adjusting, shifting their priorities to cope with the emergency situation. It is not a moment, definitely, to deprioritize those that are the most in need of protection. Needless to say that the experience from previous crises has shown that failing to adequately address unemployment, business closures, and the loss of livelihoods they entail, in addition to limited access to education and social protection, are likely to increase poverty, inequality, and vulnerability. So, while health responses are a priority and necessary, it is not enough. In the meantime, we must not forget about those who are in a vulnerable situation and who have already been trafficked. We have a moral and legal obligation to prevent trafficking, bring perpetrators to justice, and to protect victims. The pandemic clearly demands rethinking and adapting the standard responses to THP. This must include measures to maintain the critical functions of identifying and referral of victims, as well as the short-term assistance services.